ramping up, but is looking for work sooner than later the right thing to do? While some experts say taking care of yourself is just as important. With me now is Joseph Liu, joining us live from London. He's a career consultant and host of the podcast Career Relaunch. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Rochelle.
Now, as we're seeing so many people getting laid off due to the economic impact of COVID-19, so while it might not be unexpected, what can people do with the initial psychological and economic shock of losing their job?
Well, Rochelle, I think with any major career change, the impact of that change generally falls into two categories. There's the practical impact, and then there's also the emotional impact. And I think both are important to acknowledge, and both are important to manage. So taking those one at a time, when it comes to the practical impact, sometimes just sitting down and taking stock of exactly what exact changes you're going to see in your career, your life, and your family is a good starting point to figure out what sort of action plan you can then take to offset some of those changes. For example, looking at your finances, considering ways you can reduce your discretionary spending so that you can elongate that runway between where you are right now and where you want to get in your career. But the most important thing you also have to think about is the emotional impact. When you lose your job, that's going to be one of the most jarring things you ever experience in your career. So now is not an unusual time to lean in and try to tap into some of your friends and family for support, or even some of your professional colleagues or mentors for some guidance so that you can ultimately accept what's happened, move on, and show up in the job hunt in the most positive way possible, and avoid showing up in a way that's maybe bitter or resentful, which probably won't serve you very well.
Fair point. And unfortunately at this time there's that double burden of not just dealing with the stress of the outbreak, but also then perhaps having to care for someone who is sick, having to homeschool children, as well as looking for a job. What sort of tips or strategies can you share for coping with these multiple stresses?
Absolutely. So you got to, first of all, remember that how you approach your job search is going to be a signaling mechanism itself. It says a lot about who you are as a professional. It signals to employers how you might show up as an employee. So I'd suggest you think about three things. Number one, focus on those things that you can control. A lot's going to be outside of your control. All you can do is focus on those things that you can control. Second thing to think about is to just try to adopt the right attitude. Because right now, for example, I try to remember the 3 Ps: be patient, be persistent, and be proactive, because all those qualities are also going to be really important and attractive to employers who are navigating some really uncertain times. And then also to avoid the temptation of getting too defensive or apologetic about the fact that you've lost your job. I think that can sometimes happen with people who have been laid off or made redundant. And now is a good time to just remind yourself of the value that you bring to the table so that you can, first of all, convince yourself that you're a unique candidate, but also so you can then relay that to the hiring manager you're speaking with.
And I also want to talk about some of the mistakes that you're seeing people making during job hunting. Some people say, look, make looking for a job your full-time job when you're laid off. How do you advise people really structure their day to strike a healthy balance?
Yeah, so this is going to depend on how much time you've got right now. Obviously, if you're looking after your kids, if you're looking after a loved one who's dealing with COVID-19, you're going to have a limited amount of time available to you. With that said, I would always advise that you treat your full-time job as if it were you're searching for this next role. So if you've got 40 hours a week, dedicate 40 hours to it. If you've got 20 hours a week, dedicate 20 hours to it. But to try to treat it with the seriousness that it requires, because right now it's definitely an employer's job market, not necessarily not necessarily a candidate's job market. So you got to take those extra steps to do your due diligence so you can differentiate yourself from the other candidates out there.
And you raise a good point. Obviously, with over 30 million people applying for unemployment, many of whom are also looking for work, how do you differentiate yourself from the competition?
So I think right now one of the big challenges, Rochelle, that people are struggling with is visibility, because obviously with social distancing, networking has gone to the wayside. So you can't really physically network with people, even though that's one of the most effective ways to uncover job leads. So I actually recommend that people consider ways to raise their virtual profile, and so to raise your virtual personal brand. For example, you could consider doing self-publishing on platforms like LinkedIn or even Medium, or you could get involved with any sort of virtual activities or events that reinforce that sort of personal brand or that professional narrative that you're trying to build in as part of your selling story to an employer.
And just quickly, we have about 15 seconds. Is it worth staying in your career or pivoting to where the jobs are?
That's a tough one, Rochelle. I think that it's not necessarily a time when you want to give up on your dreams, but at the same time, it's a really challenging job market right now. So I think those candidates who probably look the best on paper, which follow the more traditional path, are probably going to have the best shot at landing their job. But you never know. With the right sort of narrative and personal branding, you might be able to also execute that sort of pivot.
All right, thank you so much. Joseph Liu there, career consultant and host of the Career Relaunch podcast. Up next, COVID-19 takes a bite out of the U.S. cattle market. Ranchers call on consumers to get cooking again.